world is possible, the statement between the lines is, fuck the status quo, right? And when we get back to this idea of data-driven determinism, it is inherently conservative. The patterns and trends of the past will continue into the future. It assumes that history would simply repeat itself. So based on the data we gathered and analyzed, another world is unlikely. And we've become submissive to likelihood of false dichotomies, right? How many of you have been watching this dial in real time and excruciatingly seeing how predictions fail? Like this idea that the prediction is supposed to serve, that it knows reality, that 5% of that 5% could never happen. No, 5% means that it could happen, right? And it also presents this actually false dichotomy between the status quo and reactionism, which are basically the same thing. So let's see, how are we looking at the future? How are we thinking about the future? So we talked about reactionism. Reactionism is not really about the future. It's a form of resisting the status quo, not through a vision for the future, but through a false idealization of the past. Another form that is very popular in how to think about the future is techno-determinism, a subset of data-driven determinism, of the data-driven determinism phenomenon. And the frontman for that is Ray Kurzweil, his singularity fallacy and exponential growth, this idea that we'll just exponentially shoot ourselves into a future of uploading ourselves to USBs or something. And we can see that it really has been dominating the popular imagination, covered in this allure of cutting-edge science and economics. Whether it be digital technology, biology, economics, it's depoliticizing, dehumanizing, and frankly, unapologetically, too often wrong. At the heart of that is what Orit Halpern called yesterday pessimist algorithmic optimism. We're being pessimistic about where humanity is going, optimistic for what it means for algorithms. Algorithms question, the main algorithmic question is between agency and efficiency. Neural networks are mostly model-less black boxes. They allow us to outsource excess cognitive processes. Like we no longer remember phone numbers. That's not a big deal, right? And we may no longer know how to drive at some point. That can also be arguably be a good thing to some degree. My main concern is the de-skilling of our political imagination. We are forgetting how to imagine better futures because they're not a part of the data set that has been fed into these neural networks. But we love imagining the future, right? Dystopias are probably one of the most popular forms of fiction. They're critical, and they're often the resistant stories of those who lost what we have today. The timely re-emergence of the Handmaid's Tale reminds us how dystopian can reactionary utopias become, especially these days. It inspires activism, resistance, critical examination of radical ideologies. There's a race to the bottom to identify the marks of which literary dystopia we're currently living in. Is it 1984? Or is it A Brave New World? Or maybe it's a Philip K. Dick dystopia. But while we can appreciate the critical sentiment or the rhetoric, are we simply content with a reactionary notion of going backwards to our imagined past greatness? Was the past really so good for America, for gender equality? Climate change is another data-driven dystopia. Its terminology is similar. It's about inevitability, resilience, right? How are we going to cope with that? Dystopia marks a dark future. It asks us to appreciate what we have, to not take it for granted. Lenin is attributed with the saying, the worse, the better. He was actually promoting a certain type of destruction, a certain type of apocalypse. And the value was, that's the only way to get to the communist utopia. Dystopias are conservative by design, by definition. It's a failure of the imagination or a flawed model, because especially in the case of our planet, we don't have the luxury of waiting for an apocalypse and then figuring out what's going to happen next. Like, we can't have that. 1, 2, 3, boom. Keynote effects. We need to stop at this point and figure out how are we going to point towards somewhere that is better than the dark visions that we have. It's not like the dark visions are meaningless. They are a framework that we need to work within. And we need to use data for that, and we need to analyze it. But we need to try to find ways to push towards a future that is desirable. That's the only way we can mobilize people. That's why I would argue we should cancel the apocalypse. So there are many cruel and routine lies we tell to children. But perhaps the most indicative is this. If you tell anyone your wish, it won't come true. Like, how many of you have done that? I've done that so many times, and when I read this quote from Laurie Penny, I was like, I'm never going to do that again. And I've become this annoying uncle in my son's birthdays. No, tell us what you wish for. We need to know what you wish for. Now, parents don't want to know what their children are wishing for, because then they'll have to help them get there, or they'll have to actually deal with the idea that they would come to disappointment. But no, how are we going to work toward a better future if everybody keeps their wishes to themselves? So these guys, Steve Lambert and Stephen Duncombe, Steve Lambert is going to speak right after me, so we're not moving anywhere. They founded the Center for Creative Activism, and one of the workshop is about how to win. I'm not going to speak too much about it, as Steve would, but basically they're asking activists and artists to think together, how would winning look like? And then and then after you won, what's next? What's next? What's next? They're using utopia as a tool. Now, what is utopia? Utopia, Thomas More's book from 1516, was an island of abundance where private possession was abolished. Why is it so hard to say what we wish for? Well, dystopia is what we may lose, right? Utopia is what we may gain. Behavioral economics teaches us that we are risk averse, right? We hate to lose twice as much as we love to win. I think that has some effects here as well. Dystopias are also easier. Like data-driven determinism, it is conservative. It's based on conserving what we have against the dangers of losing. In her book, No is Not Enough, Naomi Klein is arguing that resisting is just not enough. Like dystopias are not enough. She talks of utopias, and she brings up a case study, a main case study, the Leap Manifesto. The Leap Manifesto brought together a couple of organizations to work all in the same time on all of their goals. No agenda is more important than the other. Climate, financial inequality, ending racism, political reform, all at once. And there's a lot of of mobilization happening when you don't get to tell someone, no, my utopia is more important than your utopia. Rather than that, like, I want to hear about your utopia and I want to see how can we work together. Another reference I have for you is solarpunk. So solarpunk is a new and emerging science fiction genre. It started in Brazil, and unlike cyberpunk or steampunk, it's unabashedly optimistic. It's a future where our technology and our environment are not at odds. Solar energy and the distributed grid as an infrastructure are serving both as infrastructure, but also as a metaphor for distribution of power, also on a political level. Now, this is from a literary and maybe design perspective. We'll have Andrew Hudson talk about that tomorrow in the panel. But it's really important for us to work on different models for the future in multiple levels. Now, I know what you're thinking now. Why is he going on about utopia? We know what we think about utopia. This is also utopia. And this is also utopia. And this is also utopia. And to some people, this is also utopia. One man's utopia, a dystopia, is another man's utopia. And we need to take that into account. We cannot follow utopias. We know where they got us. So I'd like to bring up a model for complex scenario planning, exemplified in Peter Fraser's book, For Future. He calls it an experiment in social science fiction. Peter presented this yesterday. So what it basically did is try to think of axis of uncertainty. So one axis is scarcity versus abundance. The other one is equality versus hierarchy. And that creates not one future, but 4 futures. Some of them desirable, some of them less desirable, some of them are complex. But then he called them names and he explained them in his book, and I wouldn't try to do his work. You should just read his book. But the way that it breaks the future into a spectrum, into even a 2D space, is not the way we've been thinking about the future. So thinking about the future, or rather than the futures, is something that we've been trying to do in our collaboration between the Utopia Festival and Republica. We've done that in December. We started in December 2016 with Designing Tomorrow, a workshop that took place in Tel Aviv. We used science fiction scenarios as a methodology for extracting policy, using backcasting. Backcasting is the cooler sister of forecasting. It's rather than extrapolate from the past into the future, we're trying to imagine a future that is desirable and then try to understand how can we get there, right? Most scenarios went through catastrophe as a precursor for a desirable future, and we looked at that and we say, we missed something here. Like it can't work that way, and that's what inspired the project Cancel the Apocalypse. Yesterday we ran a workshop here together with Peter, and we worked with some of you guys to imagine futures in plural, right? So in 1 hour we had tons of futures in the room, and we could start choosing from them. In my own latest project with Shalev Moran, I tried to explore models for canceling the apocalypse, specifically in Jerusalem, a city captured by its past, unable to live in the present, let alone imagine the future. What we've done is we invited a group of established authors, activists, artists, journalists, to envision parallel futures to Jerusalem in the form of an audio tour. And we ran a workshop using both backcasting and 4 futures, and we created a pilot that launched last year with 8 different audio tours of Jerusalem. So next time you visit Jerusalem, you should download the app and experience not only the past, but the future. And I'll talk about that more in the panel tomorrow. So we need to use attractors and detractors. It's not only about utopia. And dystopia is actually not something we should get rid of. We should use dystopias to make sure we're not lost on the way. And we should use utopias as our guiding lights. So how do we build this complex model? So let's say these are options or people or goals. If we put dystopia in the center of that, everybody's running away, right? So we know we don't want to get there. Now, utopias can attract us. Like we can put a utopia and then everybody's kind of organizing around this idea. But I don't know about you guys. To me, it looks a bit too organized. I think what we need is a mix of the two. We need to pave our way through utopias and dystopias. We need to build this complex model. And this is not some Luddite position. I'm not against data and algorithms. Quite the contrary. So far, we've only scratched the surface of what can be possible with neural networks that just extrapolate the status quo. We can use these technologies to learn about change, not only about a static state. Neural networks work on the expansion of correlations in hope of finding causation. So this is one correlation, not necessarily a causation. So we've established correlation is not causation, but but it's close enough, right? It's close. The working assumption of neural networks is that it's close enough. I suggest we may be able to do something about this correlation and causation thing. If we flip it around, if we have cause on one hand, and we try to make sure that the stars align and it would correlate, and we do that through the complex model of different visions for the future, plural visions for the future. This is what I would suggest as the cancel the apocalypse methodology. So, unlike the past, which we can mine for data and analyze for insight, the future does not exist. The word should not exist. It doesn't make any sense. There's no future. There's always a plurality of futures. It's always about possibilities. And we should always think about it in that term. We should consider the probable, the possible, the desirable. We should imagine attractors and detractors, utopias and dystopias. We should use data to inform decisions, not dictate them. We should use automation to extend autonomy, not limit it. We should reclaim our political imagination. And I would leave you with one quote. She's on the horizon. I go 2 steps, she moves 2 steps back. I walk 10 steps, and the horizon runs 10 steps ahead. No matter how much I walk, I'll never reach her. What good is utopia? That's what. It's good for walking. Thank you.